So thank you all for being here with us for our first workshop on stress and ALS. We are thrilled to provide this free series to you in partnership with the ALS Association Upstate New York chapter. All of these workshops are generously sponsored by Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma America, and we are really grateful for their support. Today commences the caregiver portion of the Stress and ALS series. I'm just getting a question, will these slides be available after the meeting? Yes, they will. If you are attending this live or watching a recording of it, it will be, please be sure to sign up for the following 2 workshops on beyondmybattle.org, or you can watch these videos afterwards, courtesy of the ALS Association of Upstate New York. We will be providing a patient portion of this workshop series in early 2021 for ALS patients living in Upstate New York. That series will similarly explore the topic of mindful stress management, but will address patient-specific stressors and solutions. For those attending live, please, again, feel free to use that Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen to enter questions at any time, and I will answer them at the end. So let's get started with today's workshop. So here's a bit of an overview of what we're going to cover today. But first off, my name is Martel Catalano. I am the co-founder and the director of Beyond My Battle. We are a nonprofit organization also based in upstate New York that provides emotional support and educational resources to patients and caregivers. We support this community in managing the inherent stress that comes with having or caring for someone with an illness or disability through support groups, interactive resources, and workshops like these, focusing on mindfulness and compassion. In today's workshop, we're going to start off by talking about stress. We can't start managing or reducing it if we don't fully grasp what it is, especially for caregivers. We'll then introduce this idea of reframing stress and move on to how we can manage the overwhelming feelings we have for our loved one with ALS, and on that note, the role and the reality of grief. Next week, we will start to really dive into understand our individual stressors, which is the next step in managing stress. And in the week after, in week 3, we will work on strategies for mindful stress reduction. So again, at any time, feel free to enter something in the Q&A there. Let's get started. So what is stress? Sounds like a really simple question. But like I just said, we can't reduce something we don't understand. I see people all the time talking about what they do to manage their stress, but simultaneously not taking the time to really examine how stress works or presents itself in our individual lived experiences. So stress is really the body's reaction to any change that requires an adjustment or a response. We respond to even small stressors in life by releasing stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. Stress is a normal, essential part of life. We need stress to move out of the way of danger. We need stress to meet a deadline or pay the bills. So when we talk about stress in general, it's not so bad. It's part of surviving, and every living thing in the world has stress. In our conversations about caregiving, however, we're going to be talking about chronic stress. This is the stress that caregivers often fall into, and for what it's worth, it's also the stress that patients with illness and disabilities also face. Why it's important to understand chronic stress is because, well, it's very bad for us. I just mentioned stress hormones. In a normal passing stressful circumstance, we release these hormones and then our levels return back to normal. Oops, got ahead of myself. But when we are constantly facing stress, which caregivers are by juggling their own lives with that of another, our nervous system does not get to come back into balance. So those hormones I mentioned alter our immune system, our digestive system, our cardiovascular systems. They alter blood pressure, heart rate, and energy. And they don't get to come back to that normal place, that balanced place. So ultimately, being chronically stressed negatively impacts our health in a big way, making us less capable to show up as a supportive caregiver for our loved one. If it sounds like a vicious cycle, that's because it is. So yes, there is this vicious cycle at play when we talk about chronic stress. The obvious one is what I just mentioned, basically, which is that we have repeated stress, which takes a negative toll on our bodies, which is then stressful. So we get more stress, which increases the negative toll on our bodies, and so on. But there's another cycle I want to talk about today because it's a more subtle cycle that also includes the way we feel about things emotionally. Because of the wear and tear of prolonged stress, that chronic stress, it leads to an unavoidable state of what's called high tension and low energy. So when we're low on energy and tensions are high, we tend to form what's called a negative bias. A negative bias means that anything or everything, perhaps, has a greater chance of being perceived as negative, even if it isn't negative in reality. We've all been there before. We've all been in this place. We just can't see the goodness in anything, or we're extremely pessimistic. Even choosing what's for dinner can seem controversial or offensive. I know that's the case in my household. But this negative bias fuels more stress, of course, if we're looking at things that way and reacting to things that way in our environment. So it creates this cycle that I'm talking about here. What fuels stress even more in this cycle is that when we're stuck in it, we often find ourselves turning to temporary stress relievers like alcohol or drugs or even sugar, which only add to the problem because they create biological stress in our bodies and mental strain due to dependence. So long story short, stress leads to more stress, and there's really no denying that. But in order to break that cycle, that stress cycle, we can start to practice stress relieving solutions, right? However, for those to be successful and sustainable for the long term or for time to come, we absolutely need to become aware of how stress presents itself and how we each respond to it. Otherwise, those solutions, whatever they are just like Band-Aids. So this is a framework that we use at Beyond My Battle, and it has not only helped me personally in my own life, but it is used in schools with teachers to help children. It is used at homes to help parents manage stress with children. Looking through these, we have biological stressors that impact our physical body. We have emotional stressors like fear or worry. Anything relationship-wise is a social stressor. Cognitive stressors are typically logical thinking or planning. And lastly, pro-social stressors are feeling for another, so empathy and compassion, which we're going to talk a lot about pro-social stress later in this webinar because no surprise, it's a big one for caregivers. But I first want to highlight how and give an example as to why these stressors are often really connected and build on each other. By the way, I have the source at the bottom here for this framework. It's Dr. Stuart Shanker. The book that I would recommend reading on this to get familiar is called Self-Reg, and this whole framework is really called the Self-Reg framework. But I want to provide an example here. So let's take planning a doctor's appointment for your loved one as this example. Cognitively, you have to work out the when and the where and the timing. Then you think about how you're afraid about what you might perhaps learn from this appointment, which is in your emotional domain. You might then begin to feel what emotions your loved one with ALS has about this appointment, or just their disease in general, and that's that pro-social domain, and that might make you feel sad. And then with all of this going on, you get a headache or you get digestive issues from the stress, which I know is the category I fall into when I'm stressed, and that's your biological domain, right? So in that moment, we might feel really confused or act in ways that are less than ideal, to say the least. We often can't express what we're going through because we're typically not analyzing our experiences in the way that I just did right now. But when we begin to get familiar with our stress by using the domains to break things down or pull things apart like this, it helps in identifying stressors as they arise so that we can figure out ways to reduce them and ultimately express ourselves to others, which is a helpful tool in really great times of stress. So some of you might have heard the phrase before, name it to tame it. There has been research, particularly from a neurobiologist named Dan Siegel, that shows how just by naming, whether to ourselves or perhaps even to others, by naming what we're feeling, there is an immediate stress reducing effect or impact on us. So by saying, I'm having an emotional response to what I'm feeling right now, or this is really cognitively stressful, or maybe perhaps getting more specific about the feelings that are coming up for us is immediately going to have a stress reducing impact. But again, we're going to talk more about our unique stress profiles and how they present themselves in us, and then communication in the weeks to come. So moving on to stress, particular for caregivers, you might have heard the term caregiver burnout before. If not, you've probably experienced it. And caregiver burnout is a state of exhaustion, physical, emotional, mental, or maybe all of the above, that comes as a result of various caregiving demands, responsibilities, and pressures. We know what stress does to us, right? We know that it's toxic, and that we don't want to be able, and we also know now that we won't really be able to offer effective care to our loved one if we're always tired or sick or in discomfort. So addressing caregiver burnout is essential by restoring and replenishing, but more on that in a little bit. At the top of that burnout, or I should say on top of that burnout, and part of it is often guilt. So caregivers frequently feel guilty about tending to themselves when their loved one is sick or needs help. Guilt is so incredibly common, and I'm going to talk more about how to reframe it soon. But for now, I would just like you all, everyone who's here, to take a moment and think of a time where you felt guilty. Maybe you were trying to do something for yourself and you were not able to enjoy it because you felt like you should be taking care of your loved one. Maybe you feel like you can't be stressed out because you're not the one with the disease. Maybe you feel like you'd rather be the person with ALS. If you feel something that really is compelling you to share, I welcome you to put it in that Q&A box. It would be totally anonymous, but it's a really great exercise to just reflect, and kind of that discomfort that comes up is often what helps us move through to a greater sense of awareness, to a greater sense of compassion. So just taking a moment to reflect on that. All right. So guilt is just one emotion that we want to deconstruct in this series of webinars, but there are lots of emotions that dictate our caregiving experience. Next week, we're going to work together on identifying your unique behaviors and physical signs and triggers. But for now, just know that this is certainly really complex, and what comes out day to day, or what we see on the surface, is often covering up a lot more stuff. So hence the clever iceberg analogy here. But it's easy to see how caregivers experience frequent stress, right? A lot of that stress, though, lies below the surface. So emotional triggers, again, this is where the domains can really help, but I listed a lot of them here in no particular order, but just kind of thinking about those domains. Emotional triggers like guilt or fear or sadness are common for caregivers. Cognitively, for caregivers, we're managing tasks like planning appointments or maybe working a full-time job or overtime job to get healthcare coverage. Physical demands like moving someone around or taking on more chores at home. There's financial strain, of course, which kind of falls under that cognitive domain. But that financial strain couldn't be increasing from medical bills. So it's so clear how much is going on for caregivers here. But I just want to note that also, even our past trauma or experiences from our early years in during our childhood or our early teens, they can lie dormant and really impact our thoughts and words and our actions too. So especially if you were perhaps raised in a certain environment that perhaps portrayed a certain depiction of caregiving where you're unable to tend to your own well-being, or that's prohibited, or this pull yourselves up from the bootstraps when you're facing adversity, or perhaps you were raised in an environment where chronically sick or disabled people were being stigmatized. These things all add up, and they're really important to just know that they're part of this process that and that's kind of subconscious stuff that ends up coming out on the surface. So this is why we need to really get into reframing what stress is, what our caregiver stress is. It really makes us want to talk about those above the surface things. When a caregiver loses patience or snaps at someone, either the person, in this case with ALS, or someone else at home or at work, we tend to see that as, the caregiver would tend to see that typically as a bad behavior, and therefore view themselves as bad, right? We beat ourselves up and we're so hard on ourselves, which ultimately doesn't do anything for our relationships, whether with the person with ALS or otherwise, when we're hard on ourselves and when our self-talk and our self-worth is low. By reframing our stress, though, we can begin to see ourselves with greater understanding and compassion. When we start to understand that many of these quote unquote bad behaviors are a result of us just being stressed, we can ease up on ourselves. We also start to notice the same for our loved one with ALS in this case, or maybe even strangers. Plenty of research has shown that compassion and non-judgment for ourselves creates the same for others. So that's this reframing process of really, like we have here, look at something through a different lens or shift our point of view to a different perspective. But by reframing our stress, we begin to see ourselves in a new way. So this is especially true for caregivers. This caregiver stress needs to be reframed particularly. Caregiver stress is complex because that stress comes from so many different sources or domains, like we talked about. And we just reviewed just all of those different places that the caregiver stress is coming from. It's important to identify that how you are feeling or acting may be the result of stress. And it's important to identify where it's coming from so that we can do something about it. We can't do something about things we don't know where they're deriving from, right? Caregiver stress is also important to understand and reframe because it directly impacts the stress level of our loved one, in this case with ALS. So a little bit more on that. This is a really simple diagram, but it illustrates that our stress levels are directly connected to the people closest to us. And this is especially the case when someone is actually dependent on us. A major part of reframing caregiver stress specifically is acknowledging the role that taking care of yourself as a caregiver. There is a lot of guilt, as we talked about earlier. Caregivers often perceive taking care of themselves as a selfish act, no matter how small. And, I'm not talking about bubble baths or massages. I'm talking about caring for our boundaries, caring for our personal time and space, acknowledging the essential nature of taking care is an act of reframing your life as a caregiver. It benefits your relationship with your loved one, and therefore, in many ways, it is the opposite of selfish. So a common example I hear doing this work so often is that caregivers won't leave time in their day or their daily lives to eat well, or to go for a walk outside, or to get some exercise. Could be other things that you do for yourself that reduce your stress. These are just three that I hear most often. But this doesn't help anyone, right? Especially your loved one. Lack of movement, lack of vitamin D, lack of socialization, lack of proper vitamins and minerals, that makes us grumpy and makes us sick. Remember that stress cycle we talked about earlier. I want you to remember that every time and try to look at taking care of yourself as taking care of your loved one. And so you're avoiding getting caught in that stress cycle by doing so. So again, I'm not getting caught in this cycle requires us to be aware of our sources of stress. So one source of that stress is extremely common for caregivers, is empathizing with the person they care for. I referred to this earlier as pro-social stress. Empathy is different than sympathy, as I'm sure everyone here knows, but sometimes it's nice to just review the differences. So while sympathy is feeling sorry for someone else, empathy is the act of trying to understand someone else's circumstances or emotions. And I'd even add on to this, compassion is the act of being empathetic, but with an open heart. So we can feel someone else's emotions and not take action on that, right? There are plenty of people who do bad things in the world that are empathetic. They're able to put themselves in other shoes to either manipulate someone or whatnot. But compassion is really that next step here, and it's really what we're feeling in those moments of serious pro-social stress. But we can't possibly know what it's like to have ALS unless we have it. But empathy means trying to put yourself in that person's shoes, however possible, and compassion is, really building on that with your acts of kindness, or again, it might not be kindness, it might be boundaries, it might be good communication, it might be any words of reassurance. It looks so different for everybody. But caregivers, I want to really point out here, walk a really fine line. They walk a fine line because empathizing with your loved one's experience is important, but it can be totally debilitating. it can be really, really hard to put yourself in the shoes of someone who has physical discomfort or limitations. Imagining how they feel in body or in mind can make us want to push those thoughts away. I'm sure we've all been there before. I just don't want to deal. It doesn't have to be the person with ALS. I just don't want to feel what that person's feeling. I can't possibly understand what this group of people, perhaps in situations or circumstances, is feeling. I'd rather just not think about it. So, but running away from trying to understand what your loved one feels like leaves you as a caregiver and your loved one in your relationship, it leaves you disconnected. And we want to work on that connection. So for ALS caregivers, feeling for your loved one might feel quite extreme because their life could have been changed so much, so quickly. And I want to talk about that too. So in doing this work, I know that some diseases, such as ALS, have a sudden onset and they progress very quickly. It changes life and your visions for it rapidly. Receiving a diagnosis in a family setting changes plans, changes the life you had imagined, not just for your loved one, but for yourself. So caregivers are grieving this life. Grieving is often accompanied by 5 stages, which I'm sure many of you have heard before, the Kubler-Ross stages here. It might sound weird though to grieve someone who is alive, or maybe even weirder to think about grieving for yourself. But this is very real and very, very normal. And I just want to kind of go through these in this particular circumstance. So, you know, denial, it can set in at the time of a sudden diagnosis like this. Perhaps maybe you initially responded by wondering if it was a misdiagnosis. I see that all the time. Anger, it might not be at anybody in particular, but at the cards you and your loved one have been dealt. Bargaining, this might not occur at all for some of us actually, but it can manifest in just actually seeking control over things, trying to find things that you can control in your life because this is not a controllable thing. Or it could come up and manifest like making promises to a higher power if you're a religious or spiritual person, of course. Depression seems obvious, and it's where a lot of us tend to end up, both in the caregiving side and in the patient side. But it's really the point where seeing a mental health professional really, really helps. Seeking support, seeking a professional to work with. And lastly, I am not telling anyone to accept these circumstances right now, but that's what we're ultimately working on. And acceptance is the 5th stage of grieving. Acceptance doesn't mean joy or bliss, by the way. Acceptance can just mean that you know that there are good days and good times to come. And even when there are still bad things and bad times. Life is messy, life is unpredictable, and accepting that alone is a major feat. So now we're going to open up to questions and answers if there are any. We left plenty of time. If anybody would like me to go back to a particular slide, if anybody would like to type something in, again, your questions are completely anonymous and they can keep coming in. All right, here's the first question. So besides the stress of this disease, huge problems in the world, such as what is the planet might be like for our children and grandchildren doesn't help. Oh gosh, I could not agree more. Yes, we are going through massive, I mean, of course, these problems have always been there. The planet has been increasingly warming, and the climate has been increasingly changing in recent times due to human impact. But we're more aware of it now than ever, and that is a huge thing. That is a huge thing to just know what your boundaries are. I have found in my life, in patients' lives, in caregivers' lives, what are your boundaries with taking that kind of information in? The news cycle definitely encourages us to keep our attention to it. So if you are a person who notices that you have the TV on all the time at home, and I'm kind of making this really, really basic, right? Like, these are serious issues. Politics are serious right now. COVID is serious right now, especially for those with illnesses and disabilities, and for caregivers. The climate change is a serious issue right now. There's so many serious issues right now. But what my advice is to really reflect on what kind of boundaries you can establish. If people you're hanging out with are always wanting to talk about those things, maybe for periods keeping them at an arm's length, or limiting your time, keeping the news on to only certain amounts of time, and of course finding joy wherever possible. So if it means going for walks outdoors to remind yourself of the beautiful, beautiful planet that we do get to experience, and we hope that our children and our grandchildren can experience. And lastly, I'll just wrap that up by saying, if you have time in your life, of course, volunteering, it reduces that stress greatly, whether it's volunteering for political things, or climate things, or injustice issues. I have found personally, and I keep hearing all over that, just giving back, giving some time, is really great stress reducer there too. So next question says, how does a caregiver communicate to the loved one with ALS that we are taking time for ourselves to better take care of them? Yes, so we're gonna really get into this in week 3, to the person who asked, and I don't want to spoil anything, but it's difficult, right? It's difficult to tell someone that I need time for me in order to take time for you. But the first thing I would ask in this situation is, have you tried to say that before? And maybe the answer is yes. Maybe you have said, hey, I really need to take some time for me this morning, or each night before I go to sleep, or maybe at lunch, I'd like to eat lunch in a certain way, for myself, so that I can show up best for you. I need to recharge my batteries. I can't pour from an empty cup. And so I would first ask, has this been said? And the second question I would ask here is, how has it been said? And again, we're going to get into this in week 3 much more, but the way we say things is so, so important. The tone of voice, the facial affect, if there's big gestures involved. I find for myself in difficult conversations that making sure I'm sitting down when I communicate things that are difficult to hear for someone helps me keep my cool, and makes me feel not threatening. So those are just some baseline things, but again, we'll get more into that in week 3. Cool. Next question says, I feel like I've gone through some stages of grief and generally accept what it is, but I do sometimes slip back to one of the previous stages. That is so incredibly natural. If you read about grief, if you read about the stages of grief, we can actually be in multiple stages at once, and we can go back. Things that trigger us. We talked about triggers just a little bit today. So we have triggers for anger. We have triggers of our traumas in our life or our suffering in our life. We also have triggers of grief. If we have, in the most extreme example of grief, of course, grieving someone who has passed away, you know, I just recently talked to a friend who said a song came on for her aunt, and it was her aunt's and her husband's wedding song, and that reminded her of him, and he'd been passed away for like 10 or 20 years, and that took her back, and that is totally natural. And this is really where the self-compassion comes in, because we can't beat ourselves up about those things. That is the process, and it's life ebbs and life flows, and it's not a straight line, right? So next person says, everyone offers their help, but each day is a new day of challenges that exhaust us. We try to figure it out, but it seems friends, etc., get exacerbated when we don't ask for help. So I think what I'm hearing here is, yes, it's exhausting to be a caregiver, 100%. And friends, so friends are getting kind of frustrated with us when we don't ask them for help. Everyone handles caregiving differently. Some people need more help from friends than others. We're going to get into how important support systems are, but support systems can be found in all different ways, right? Like we offer at Beyond My Battle a caregiver support group, for instance, every Tuesday night online. And that might be the support that person needs. It might be the more anonymous support, just feeling heard, and, meeting up with new people, and so on, and having a facilitated person there, that might be that person's form of support. Another person's form of support might be calling friends to come over or help cook dinner, or just talk on the phone. But support is found in all different ways. So I think if a friend is frustrated that we're not asking, the first thing to do would be to self-reflect on, how am I presenting to my friends? Am I presenting in a really pessimistic way that is concerning? Can I maybe work on that so that my friends don't feel like I am perhaps in danger, mental, emotional, bad space? So we can do that kind of self-work. And then also if we're doing okay and we're not really portraying that kind of a message, to really, again, communicate to our friends, hey, have we done that? Have we communicated to our friends, and how have we done it? Have we said, I'm doing okay and I prefer to get support in these ways, or right now I don't really feel like talking about this. And if people don't respect those boundaries of ours, then that's a whole other conversation. The next person says, my loved one with ALS mentions how sorry he feels for me. Yes. Do you recommend your ALS partner watch these workshops too? I would recommend your partner go to the patient portion of this, which is going to be keep an eye on your emails, but it should be in February of 2021. We want to leave some time for the holidays too, which I know are stressful. But I would recommend that workshop, because we're going to talk about that there. We're absolutely going to talk about pro-social stress, because I can speak for myself as someone living with a rare disease and a disability that causes me to slowly, in my case, I'm losing my eyesight. So I feel like a burden on people often when I have to ask for rides or ask for help, or my independence is much slowly, steadily, like losing that part of myself. And I relate to that so much, because my parents, my partner, I feel that I don't want to sometimes ask for help, or what must it be like to be my parents? And it's genetic in that case. It's like they somehow gave this to me, and they didn't know it. And I can't imagine what that would feel like. But it is part of the process for the patient, feeling the caregiver's emotions is certainly part of it. And it's I just want to say to that person who asked this question, how wonderful for you to have a loved one who feels that for you. I hope that you are grateful for your compassionate and your empathetic loved one. A lot of people living with chronic diseases and disabilities are very frustrated and very angry, and don't quite allow themselves to go there emotionally. So yeah. um uh yeah, and I'm just getting some extra comments. Yes, she's absolutely wonderful and courageous. That's great.